Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
Well, John, we're finally back together in the same room now that our lockdown is finished.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it feels very strange.
It's been a few months now since we've been able to actually get together and record and be in the same room, but we've now finally had some of our COVID restrictions lifted, and we're able to actually get together and maybe start working again on some projects.
Yeah, our last episode there was a little rough around the edges. Had some satellite interruptions while recording. It's a little hard to work around. So we decided to just take a little break until we could record in person again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's I'm happy to say that we were able to start working on things again. So hopefully we can get back to our watch and we can record some more episodes and keep chatting more.
Konstantin Chaikin's already released it for us.
This is the problem. COVID has slowed us down, and Chaikin has beaten us to the Minotaur watch.
It looks like he's even used a laser to engrave a lovely motif on the dial, reminiscent of a maze.
Yeah,
that looks,
Well, this is the problem. We couldn't work fast enough, and now somebody else has beaten us to the punch.
Or at least we do have some prior art that has been published.
Yes, absolutely.
The cover art for episode 82 does show the laser engraved maze that we had put together for our little project.
And I'm happy to see other people doing interesting things with it. Well, I'm curious to see what it actually looks like on his end when it finishes. I think the photos that I saw was an incomplete dial, so I'm curious to see what he does with it, if he decides to fill in any of the maze like we were thinking about doing, or if he's just going to leave it as a laser engraved piece of gold and leave it like that. So hopefully we'll be able to start working on ours again very shortly.
Mm-hmm. I had presumed that was his finished product, but I suppose maybe he'll fill it in. Who knows? So last episode we talked a little bit about bistable mechanisms and compliant mechanisms and the like. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple instances in there where I used the words interchangeably in ways that I should not have, and I do apologize for that. So a number of times when I was talking about various things having to do with watchmaking, it is compliant mechanisms that I was referring to and not necessarily bistable. Mm-hmm. Although there are bistable mechanisms used in watchmaking as well. The vast majority of the ones I was referring to are actually compliant mechanisms. So I apologize for the fumble there.
Someone we've spoken about a number of times on this podcast is Dr. Robert Organ. He is the deputy warden of the Goldsmiths Company, and specifically the assaying office in London. And I met Robert through the Santa Fe Symposium. He was a speaker the first year that I was a speaker, and he gave a very entertaining talk on how the Goldsmiths Company had been responsible for helping to catch people who were trying to counterfeit antique silver. And he gave a great talk on that and the work that the Goldsmiths Company was doing as part of their assaying division and actually hallmarking work. And he and I hit it off. He's a Welsh man who's a fan of rugby, so we got to chatting about rugby while we were on the speaker's trip and hit it off. And he invited me to come and visit the assaying office, and that's when Rich and I actually went in there and did a tour of the assaying office while we were over there for one of our trips. Robert has decided to retire after 21 years in the industry. And he's decided to pass on the reins. I don't know who it is that's going to be taking over and when he's actually retiring, but he has finally decided to retire, and we're sad to see him go. He was a great voice in the community and was an excellent champion for the people actually in the industry working, the jewelers in the industry working, and making sure that they were protected and that their work was protected. So thanks very much to Robert, also for the chance that he gave me speaking at the Goldsmiths Congress a few years ago. He specifically asked me to come over and talk for that, and I was very pleased that he gave me that opportunity because that was an excellent launching point for a few other discussions and collaborations that I've had since then. So I do appreciate that offer as well.
Yeah, I was very fortunate that the two of you crossed paths and that you've been able to have so many neat experiences as a result of that meeting.
And it's entertaining being able to see some of the work that they were doing in behind the scenes, and including some of the coins left over from the trial of the Picts, which is going on right now as well. We've spoken about that, and that's the ancient trial that is done to assay the quality of coins coming out of the Royal Mint. I'm pretty sure that in one of our old shows, and we'll have to go back and figure out which one it was, there's a photo of myself holding one of the 1 kilogram gold coins that they had produced that year. I think it was for the Queen and Prince Philip's wedding anniversary. I think there was a special coin done for that. And this year they have chosen to commemorate James Bond 007 with a 7 kilogram coin.
A 007 kilogram coin, I'll have you know.
Oh, sorry, you're right. 007 kilogram coin. And a few people that I know who work at the assay office had sent me some photos of them holding these coins. And it is quite the upgrade from the one that Rich and I were able to handle when we were there. Sadly, they don't seem to be willing to send me one as for testing purposes.
Like, I can't imagine it's a coin you'd be wanting to carry around in your pocket.
No. It's a little bit large and a little bit heavy.
So way back in episode 30 of this show, it was titled Hazy Blue Halo, I talked a little bit about some photos and my woes, trying to get some good photos of a watch that I was working on. A small number of those photos have finally come to be printed, and they've been published in the latest edition of the NAWCC's bulletin. So that's the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. The timepiece in question was the very first documented pocket watch crafted on Canadian soil. Mm-hmm. So it's really neat to be able to have taken part in bringing that timepiece back to life, that bit of Canadian history. If you're curious to see it, you can now see some of those photos in the latest edition of the bulletin.
Now, I haven't had a chance to read this article yet, so you'll have to pardon some of the questions, but what was it that needed to be worked on? I assume that there needed to be some level of restoration and maybe conservation on the piece. Obviously, this is going to be, 100 plus years old at this point. So what kind of work did you need to do on this piece?
It was an exercise in conservation. So when it came to me, it was completely non-functional.
Okay.
You could wind it up and the balance would move freely, but there was no motion passing through the gear train. So the piece was made by the first student of the Canadian Horological Institute. His name was John Kincaid, and he effectively made everything in the watch from raw stock, with the exception of the jewels and then the mainspring and the hairspring. And this was all under the tutelage of Henry Plaitner, who founded the Canadian Horological Institute. And there were a pair of watches that were made when the school first opened up. There were actually only 2 students, and they are effectively identical. There are a few subtle differences between the 2 pieces. But yeah, when it came to me, it was not working at all, despite looking like it should be able to work, given that the balance was moving and there were no notable bits of wear anywhere. Getting it out of the case was actually a bit of a challenge. Okay. It turned out at some point in its history, someone had affixed it with some sort of epoxy or resin or something. So I actually dismantled part of it while in the case before being able to get to a point where I could release the main plate from the case and then get the dial and the hands off, and then put everything in for the preliminary cleaning. Which is kind of unfortunate in terms of running any sort of forensics on how things were in situ as it had originally come to me. In examining things under higher magnification after everything had been cleaned, it just looks like there were some raised burrs in around the barrel that were causing the issues. It was clear working on it that he was in a rush to finish it. And there are images of some of those cut corners in the article that was published. I
can't imagine a student rushing a project at the end of a school year. I've never heard that happening.
Well, it sounds like he actually made the watch in a matter of months. So I believe it was about 3 months. Okay. It was quite quick because Plaitner, I think, was in a rush to have something to show and to promote the school and say, come to the school, this is what you'll be able to do. And no other students after this made a watch like these original 2. They actually had quite a bit more latitude in what they did. Okay. But it's interesting looking at this piece and having seen other pieces made by some of the later students, and also having read a book that Henry Plaitner published about 20 years later on the Swiss lever escapement and sort of the pitfalls of it and where things can go wrong and what you need to do. And pretty much every pitfall in the book could be seen in this initial watch. So it's clear that at the very least Kincaid wasn't fully privy to all the different ways that things could go wrong. But I would imagine even Plater may not have known at that time.
Right.
And there's some other things too that were consistent some things improved over the course of these watches as they were being made, and other things sort of stayed the same. One thing that was unusual to me is that a lot of the students filed the square on the arbor for their barrels off center just slightly. And it's some pretty simple math to work out how to file a square concentrically. So there's some consistencies and inconsistencies with foibles, let's say, that can occur when you're making a watch. And it's neat to see the evolution and the fact that Plater picked up on a lot of these and distilled them into a book. But working on this piece while also needing to conserve it was quite a challenge.
I was going to say that the conservation part of this really limits a lot of the work that you can do. Mm-hmm. This is something that I've had a number of discussions with conservators about how to deal with various things. And in my brain, there's this desire to bring something back to not necessarily the original state that it was in when it was made, but at least bring it back so that it's functional to that level again. And often that is at cross purposes with conservation, where they don't care about it working. In fact, in many cases, they don't want it working because then it's just going to continue to wear. They want it to stop in the state that it's currently in, and they don't want it to progress deteriorate any more than it is right now. So that must have created a limit for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly did. It was a lot like working on a prototype and not being able to correct the inherent problems within the prototype, but rather conserve some of those. I shouldn't say some of, conserve as many of the errors as possible while still getting it to run again. Okay. Because at some point in its life, it was functional and it did work, and it served Kincaid for a number of years until his untimely death.
Now, is this owned by a public institution like a museum, or is this owned by a private collector?
At the moment, it is owned by a private collector. It is destined to be bequeathed to a museum here in Canada. Right now, the watch is in the possession of Gary Fox, who's a Canadian. He's actually the author of a biography about Henry Plater. Okay. It's a book entitled Canada's Master Watchmaker. And he recently completed another book about the Elgin Watchmakers College, which Henry Plater helped found for Elgin down in the States, which was effectively his exit from the Canadian Horological Institute and spelled the end for the Canadian Horological Institute and sort of native watchmaking as we knew it up till that point. I was probably, in terms of the pieces produced by the Canadian Horological Institute, I was probably the most preeminent institute of horological training that we have had here in Canada. And it is unfortunate that it did see its end, but it was effectively spearheaded and kept afloat by this one man. It was a completely privately run college. He had to finance that all himself. It was not a public institution.
Okay. How long did it run for?
Just under 30 years.
Okay, that's actually a reasonable run for any kind of private school like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And the pieces that came out of it are quite remarkable as well. I mean, you had Canadians producing tourbillons, carousel watches, minute and quarter repeaters, all sorts of different things, and various escapements tried as well. So it's really remarkable what they achieved.
Roughly when did the school shut down?
Just prior to the 1920s, I believe.
Okay. All right. Interesting. It's really unfortunate. I know when I started looking around for ways of learning watchmaking, there's obviously the school that's in Trois-Rivières, which you're familiar with, but there really aren't a lot of options in Canada for learning watchmaking, which is one of the reasons why I ended up taking the BHI distance learning course, because unless I was willing to go to Trois-Rivières or move out of the country to get watchmaking training, there just wasn't an option for me here in Canada, which is it's too bad considering the need for modern watchmakers. It really is unfortunate.
And perhaps if things had worked out better with his allies at the outset, and maybe had they agreed more on the direction they wanted to take the school in, perhaps it would have persisted longer. Right. The gentleman that he initially started the school with, they eventually parted ways quite early on in the foundation of the school. Okay.
It's great to see that you were involved in the conservation of this piece. It's nice to see that it's actually back up and running again, which is lovely to see. And I'm curious to read this article because it's you and I've spoken about it sort of offline quite a bit over the last. Well, it's been a while since you've been working on this project, so I'm really curious to see what the results of it are and where it ends up eventually, where it's where it finishes its life, and hopefully somewhere on display that we can go and see it.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the photos go, there aren't too many of them that ended up making the final cut, and some of them themselves literally got cut in publication in the way that they're framed and whatnot.
Yeah.
So at some point I hope to publish some more of those photos as well, so that even more of this history can be preserved and persist on.
Have you considered publishing technical details of this watch? Like, is that something that you've thought about doing?
So I didn't capture a whole lot in terms of technical details, just the odd sketch here and there to remediate things. So if I had intended to do that, I would have gone into greater detail. The other reason this isn't something I'd put any thought or had considered at all is that because these were student-made watches, a big part of them making them was drafting up the technical drawings. And a lot of those technical drawings have persisted and live on. And that's actually how Gary, the current owner, came to know about the Canadian Horological Institute. He just happened to be at a flea market somewhere. Someone learned he was into watches. They pulled out a portfolio of technical drawings and school photos and said, would you have any interest in this? And he snapped
went down
that
the
up
rabbit hole.
and then went down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
Huh. And have those been published somewhere?
Yes. So a lot of that has been published in the books that he has published about Henry Platner and about the Elgin School. So those are available. I mean, there's certainly more than what's just in those books, but there's enough there to give a good sense of what went into the thinking and design of the various masterpiece watches that the students created.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to see that a bit of our horological history has survived, because we don't have a lot of it. So we need to keep as much of it going as we can.
Yeah, very, very small amount of it. And if you happen to be in the UK, the Museum of the British Horological Institute does have another of the CHI, the Canadian Horological Institute, pieces on display by one of the students, Francis Bentley. And I don't know if it's currently on display, but they certainly do have it in their archives, and you may be able to get special permission to go in and see it if it's not out.
They actually have quite a bit of their collection on display, and they've been recently redoing a bunch of their displays. I know that they've just created a new display for their talking clock. They have the first and second talking clocks that were used through there was a phone number you could dial in the UK to be able to, actually there still is, you could use to get the accurate time, and they have the first two of those that were made, and they have those on display, and you can actually go and listen to them and read up about those. So they've just created a new exhibit for that. And I know when I was there a couple of years ago now, they were in the process of revamping their watch exhibit as well. They do have quite a few clocks, but they've got an impressive watch collection there as well. So they were in the process of redoing that when I was there a few years ago. So yeah, if you're in the area of the BHI, Fridays, I believe they're open to the public for the museum, and it's absolutely worth going in. It's an excellent museum.
Now, while I may have encountered a woe or two while working on conserving Kincaid's work, you've encountered a fair number of woes recently with your 3D printers again.
It's never ending, John. 3D printing is supposed to be what's going to, the future of manufacturing, and everything is a bright and sunny future in the 3D printing world, but it's not as nice as as everybody wants to make it out to be. And a large part of that comes down to the fact that I'm trying to print with resins that can be used for casting. If you're interested in 3D printing and you don't care about using castable resins, as we call them, then ignore everything that I'm about to complain about. Because, a lot of the modern materials that they have are unbelievably useful. So we're talking primarily about my Formlabs Form 3 printer, which I've had for just a little over a year now. And it is a remarkable printer in a lot of ways. And the non-castable resins that I've used with it are excellent. Specifically, I've been using their rigid 10K resin for making fixtures and things like that in the shop. So one of the projects that I'm currently working on is doing the anglage on the movements for my watches. Swartz Chen has sent me the bridges for my movements, and I'm doing all the anglage work on them. And I've been able to produce plates that hold and support those bridges in exactly the ways that they need to be. It's nice because I was able to model and then 3D print them out of this rigid 10K material And then I could drill and tap the holes to be able to screw down the plates to the bridges to these support plates. For things like that is absolutely brilliant. I've also made dies for doing hydraulic forming in them and things like that. And some of the materials like that are absolutely exquisite. Unfortunately, there are a lot of compromises when you have to deal with the castable resins. And it's a problem because you need a resin which can be burned out properly as part of the burnout process in the lost wax casting. And that leads to some issues. And over the years, a bunch of companies have tried to produce different resins which have all of the features that you want. You want it to be something that can be dimensionally stable. You want it to be something that's going to have sharp, crisp detail in it. But then you also need it to burn out properly. And they've got resins which do sort of two of the three things, but never all three of them. And depending on what compromises you're willing to make, you can use different resins. The purple castable resin that they use, I don't remember the exact name of it. It's an excellent resin for printing with. It's very, very dimensionally stable. It's very easy to print with. There's very few print problems with it. It's actually quite a nice resin to work with, and it's pretty easy to use. Unfortunately, when you cast with it and you do the burnout, the resin expands when you heat it, which can then cause problems of cracking in your investment plaster. So you really need to use a very high-strength investment plaster when you're casting with it. And that's something that I'm just not set up to be able to use. A lot of the platinum and sort of steel investment plasters are excellent for that kind of work, but they're also sort of a ceramic type investment plaster. And so you need different tools and different ways of handling it. The temperature that you have to cure it at is much higher than what I'm used to with my kiln. And in fact, I'm not even sure if my kiln would be able to handle it very well. So it's problematic for me if I want to be able to cast using that purple resin here in the studio. I just don't really have the facilities to be able to do that. If I'm sending the castings out, like for instance, I've been casting through Techform. They've been doing the 316L stainless steel casting for me. And they're all set up for doing that because they're using these high temperature investment plasters to be able to cast platinums and stainless steels and things like that. So for them, it's trivial to deal with this resin because it doesn't, it just doesn't break in their molds. That's been a problem for me. I haven't been able to print my own work here using that resin and then cast it. And then I guess early in the year, Formlabs ended up bringing out a new castable 40 resin, I think is what they called it. And, on paper, it's like, hey, this is great. This, it has a higher wax content in the resin. Looks like it's actually quite nice to cast with. So I purchased some of that, and it's not quite as nice to print with as they make it out to be initially. One of the big problems is that you end up with 10% shrinkage from with this resin between the print model and then cleaning it off and then, getting to use it in the casting. And for some of us, actually for many of us jewelers, 10% shrinkage is far too excessive. You can't account for all of the things that are going to happen when you shrink a model by that much, especially because you're not getting consistent shrinkage in X, Y, and Z. So X, Y tends to be pretty consistent, but then the Z axis ends up having really weird shrinkage in terms of how much you're getting there, and that's where the layers are building up, is over that Z axis. Unfortunately, it's trivial to cast with. Like it doesn't expand at all in the investment plaster. I get beautiful castings out of it, but I don't get dimensionally stable parts, and so I've been really frustrated with that. And the Formlabs printer is really nice to use. It's very simple from a user point of view, but these castable resins are such a nightmare in terms of taking trade-offs and using one over another.
And so for the cost of a couple of liters of this castable resin, you've gone out and bought a whole new 3D printer?
I'm actually trying another printer right now to see what sorts of options I have with other resins. One of the other issues with the Formlabs printer is that you must use their cartridges with their resins, and unless you hack one of their cartridges to put in your own resin into it, you can't actually use a third-party resin in a Formlabs printer, and that's one of the biggest limitations of it. And their resins are not cheap. Their consumables are not cheap, and so you have to balance that out. And right now, I've been playing with some of the. We've talked about the blue cast resin that I've used in the past, and they've got a more modern resin that they've developed, and it's nice in a lot of ways. So I ended up picking up an Anycubic Mono X printer off of Amazon, and as you say, they're not very expensive. You're talking $700 or $800 Canadian right now to pick up one of these printers. They're very high resolution. They're using a 4K display to be able to project onto the build surface, so you're getting very nice resolutions out of it. There's also limitations with it. It doesn't have a lot of the nice to haves that the Formlabs printer has. So it doesn't heat the build chamber, for instance. That's not a problem when you're dealing with these ABS-like resins that a lot of people are using when they're printing miniatures or models or something like that. But when you're printing with these castable resins, they are very temperature sensitive. And so they need to be, let's say, 30 to 32 degrees Celsius in there, ideally. And so if your build chamber isn't warm enough, then you can have print failures because of that. So there's little challenges like that you end up having with these sort of cheaper printers. While I'm getting very good resolution out of it, there are still problems where, parts will release from the build plate and partway through the build. And so that ruins that particular model that you're growing there. So you get a lot more failures with a printer like this than you do with something like the Formlabs printer.
Yeah, you haven't actually been able to successfully print a set of the lugs without them tearing away from the build plate.
That's been a problem for me. The lugs have enough surface area that they're causing me problems, and I'm really unhappy with that. Smaller parts, I'm not having any issues with printing. I've been trying to print some pen parts and things like that, like barrels and caps, and those have actually printed okay. So I have maybe sort of a 75% success rate with printing a pen barrel, for instance, and it's producing nice parts that are circular and cylindrical and have the right wall thickness and everything like that. I'm reasonably pleased with the way that some of that's going. And certainly for other parts, like the buckles, for instance, I've been able to print those, and they've come out just fine, and I have no issues with them. I'm actually thinking about taking a sort of a two-pronged approach with my 3D printing going forward. I was trying to decide if I was going to keep this Anycubic printer, and I think I'm going to. And mostly because I want to be able to use that blue cast resin for when I'm casting here in-house. It is a much nicer resin to deal with in-house when it comes to the actual casting process. And so I think I'm going to use it for anything that I'm going to cast here, whether it's small parts or other jewelry or whatever, cufflinks, those sorts of things. I'll cast that stuff here in-house. I don't bother sending that stuff out. For things like the lugs and the buckles for my watches, I'm not going to be dealing with that casting. So I'm not so concerned about the expansion of that resin. Techform's going to be doing those castings for me. And so I think I'm just going to continue using the purple castable resin in the Formlabs printer. That I have no problems when it comes to the, print failures. I have no print failure issues with that in the Formlabs printer for those lugs and those buckles. So I think I'm just going to continue using that. It's a little bit more expensive, but I think I'm okay with that. And the trade-offs are worth it considering, the quality of prints that I'm getting out of that and the fact that Techform has no issues with printing or with casting with those. So the other consideration is potentially using a hacked cartridge in the Formlabs printer. You can buy these little electronics modules that you can hack into the old cartridges, and then you can put your own resin into that, into that cartridge. The problem then is that you have to tell it that it's a particular type of resin that closely matches the print requirements, the print parameters of this resin that you've decided to put in there. And so it's frustrating because you can't just say, all right, this is the exposure time that you should use. These are the temperature that you should have in the build tank. You can't just pick and choose all those parameters. You have to go and sort of find a resin that works. And so there's some trial and error there. But I may try that as well and see how well that works, because honestly, a lot of the build of the Formlabs printer is amazing. It's great. But it is really frustrating that you can only use their resins. And so if you're having issues with their resins and you're not happy with them, you're pretty much stuck with that unless you want to do sort of go off the reservation and actually, try some different processes and sort of do stuff that's not supported at all by the community or by Formlabs. So sort of a double-edged sword there when you're dealing with a nice, easy to use product like that, but you're locked into their ecosystem.
So is your Formlabs out of warranty now, or would this void your warranty anyway using a non-prescribed resin?
I'm pretty sure it's out of warranty. I think they've only got a 1-year warranty on the printers, and I don't know if it would void the warranty on it. I suspect it probably does. There's probably some verbiage in that warranty agreement that they won't cover any damages that they think is caused by that. So, that would be something else to consider if you were going to start using this. I would recommend that if you're thinking about getting into 3D printing as a jeweler, I would think twice about using a Formlabs printer. The initial cost as well as the cost of the materials and the consumables are quite high. And I think you would be better off initially getting into a lower end printer, something like an Anycubic Mono X, or Elegoo have another one that's similar in terms of size and build volume and resolution as this one. I think you'd be better off dealing with one of those printers. Certainly there are a couple of other printers that are in between the price of those and a Formlabs printer, some that are a little bit more professional, and they would probably do quite well also. So I think if you're going to do your own printing and your own casting with those prints, I would certainly recommend getting into 3D printing with a cheaper printer and something that you have more flexibility, because there are dozens of different castable resins on the market now. B9 put out some really nice resins. As I said, Bluecast put out some nice resins, and there's a few others that are out there on the market. And this Anycubic printer will allow me to experiment with some of those other resins. I can buy a half liter of one of those other resins for $120 and experiment with it and get to know it and see how well it works. And I can pick and choose the ones that I like, and I can then end up with a result that I'm happy with. So I like that flexibility with the Anycubic printer. It gives me that flexibility. And, frankly, I can start doing things like I'm building a heating element for the build chamber so that I can heat the build chamber and make sure that it's a good temperature for the prints and everything like that. And, so there are ways that I can easily modify these printers. They're not difficult to sort of hack and work on.
Well, hack away. We've talked about the Rigid 10K a bit in the past, but that's not originally what you had intended to use for making the fixtures for putting the anglage on the plates. What eventually brought you down this path?
Yeah, my damn mill. My tag mill is something that I've struggled with. I've had a love-hate relationship with that tag mill over the years. It's a small desktop CNC mill that's out there, and I've had that one for I want to say that I bought it in 2007, 2008, something like that. So it's, I've had it for a long time, and I used to use it primarily for machining waxes. So I would use a very hard jeweler's wax, and it machines beautifully. If you use a high-speed spindle, 20,000, 25,000 RPM spindle, and a very small cutter, so the tip on it is maybe 0.005 of an inch thick. So it's a little thicker than a sheet of paper. And you can get some beautiful detail out of a piece of hard wax like that. So I did a lot of machining of that. And in fact, many of my first pens, a lot of my first jewelry, that was all being machined from those waxes. And they were really, really nice to work with.
Indeed. One of my favorite of your pens was birthed on that mill.
So, so it was a good mill. And I have put literally thousands and thousands of hours into that mill from a machining point of view. But it's also had thousands and thousands of hours on it. And so I've had to do a lot of upgrades over the years to try and keep it operational. And a lot of those are starting to catch up to it in terms of their reliability. So one of the things I did a few years ago was I replaced the V-thread screw that was in there that was driving each of the axes. And I replaced them with ball nuts and ball screws, which are typically more accurate and they have less resistance. So there's better energy transfer. So they move the machine around faster and more efficiently. But unfortunately, the small ball screws that I have to use in order to get, to fit everything in the existing castings that are there. They're quite small and they're not really that high quality. So I'm getting a lot of lost motion in those axes now. And unfortunately, with some of the work that I want to do now, like for instance, machining these support plates for the bridges, that kind of work requires a lot of precision. And when you're losing 0.006 of an inch of travel every time it makes a direction change, that adds up very, very quickly, particularly with a lot of these high-speed machining toolpaths. And I was just having too many problems with it. So I did a couple of other upgrades to see if they would help fix the problem, and I just cannot get it accurate enough at this point to do that kind of work. And so it's going to still do some work, but sort of less critical work and things which don't require high-speed machining toolpaths and things like that. So it'll be able to hold some tolerances a little bit better than what it is. But I've basically decided that it's going to be sort of retired at this point, and the work that I was planning on doing with it, I'm doing in other ways. So that's allowing me to take advantage of things like the 10K, the rigid 10K, to be able to print those support plates, doing the prints to be able to have the lugs cast, for instance, because I had thought about machining the lugs on the tag mill, but I'm realizing now that it's not going to be able to support doing that kind of work for me. So fortunately, I have other ways of doing the work that I would planned on doing on it. But I think it's pretty much at the end of its life at this point for me.
In most respects, this mill would not recognize itself.
No, it's sort of a mill of Theseus, right? It's been, all the parts have slowly been replaced. I mean, even the headstock at this point, that column, that sort of iconic column that the tag mill has, it's now a piece of 35 millimeter linear rail that has a big spindle on it and everything. And it's really the only thing that's still there from the original machine is the XY casting, sort of the saddle casting that's there, and then the table top. Other than that, I've basically replaced everything on this mill. I sort of realized that I either needed to spend a lot of time and energy upgrading this machine to do what I need it to do, or I just needed to figure out a different way of working on it right now. And I'm now looking into which machines to replace it with. So I'm probably going to start looking at either a Haas mini mill, one of their super mini mill 2s, or potentially the Haas compact mill, depending on features and what I actually need this machine to do. So that's sort of where I'm going down next, is to replace it with one of those machines.
And the whole reason you had endeavored to make these fixtures for the plates and bridges was to do some finishing work on the timepieces that you've been working on. And how's that been going?
It's been an interesting process. I've got a lot of experience finishing metals. One of the nice things about being a jeweler is that you spend a lot of time finishing metals and learning about how to finish metals and how to highly polish things. So it's been nice taking those skills and working with them in a different way. And that different way at this point is taking the raw bridges that Swarsetchen have machined for me for my movements, and I'm taking them and I'm refinishing the surface of them. So I'm using a crushed ruby to basically sandblast the top surface of the bridges and put a very nice sort of a nice finish on it. It's not a satin finish that's on it. It's got a bit of a specular highlight finish to the to the surface, which is nice. I like it. It's a bit of a different contrast to a lot of the other finishes that people are using on bridges. And then I'm doing all the anglage on it. So I'm actually putting those original bevels on the parts because the way they've machined them, they're just square edges that are on all the parts. So I'm doing all the beveling that's on there and then bringing all of that up to a high polish. And same thing with all of the countersinks. I'm doing all the countersink work and then polishing all those countersinks as well. And then once I'm finished with all these, I'll be plating them to protect the surface finish because they are brass, so they'll eventually oxidize if I don't plate them. So I'll end up plating them and then send them back to Swarsetchen, where they can then install all of the rubies, set them all properly, build the watches, time them, make sure that everything is timed properly and everything is working properly. And then they'll send me back the finished movements once they're done with them.
And because we are recording this in an audio medium and not a visual medium, just for our more astute listeners, it is not a specular finish. It is a speckled finish.
Speckled finish. Thank you. Yes.
A specular finish is much more mirror-like
than
what you've achieved here, which is actually quite beautiful. It's not what you would typically think of when you think of sandblasted finish or bead-blasted finish in watchmaking. This has a lot more depth and nuance to it.
It's sort of an interesting compromise because I'm a big fan of the texture difference, the contrast that you get with a bead blast or a sandblasted finish versus the high polished edges that you end up with from the anglage. I'm a really big fan of that. Like it's a very classic look in English watchmaking, for instance, where you get these nice finished, sort of even finished fields on the plate, and then you'll end up with a very bright polished cut from an engraving, for instance, from a hand engraving. I love the look of that. I think that's a really nice contrast. It's very different than using something like a Côte de Genève or something like that. But I really do like that contrast. And then I also really like the texture that you get from something like what Redzepi does, for instance, where he's doing the hand punched fields, to be able to do a deeper texture. But that's being done at that it is a much deeper punch mark that's being put into the part, even though it's not very deep at all. Like to the human eye, it doesn't look very deep, but it is much deeper than what I'm getting out of this. So this is kind of a nice sort of middle ground between the two of them. You're getting a little bit more reflection, a little bit more detail and character out of it, and then you are out of something like the bead blasting, but it's not going quite as far as that hand punched surface that somebody like Redzepi is doing. And I like the balance between them. It's sort of a nice compromise.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly distinctive compared to, say, the old English frosting or what Redzepi is doing, or indeed just about any other sandblasting that you see on other watches. I think the only pieces I can think of that sort of would compare somewhat in this level of speckledness would be from like the Gronfeld brothers or Grubel Forzi. They've executed similar finishes in some of their pieces, but even then, I don't think it's quite as pronounced or deep as what you've achieved here with the crushed ruby.
I think the first time I'd heard anybody doing something with crushed ruby like this was one of the Japanese watchmakers. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was a couple of years ago that I saw it, and it was interesting the way he was doing it because he would put the part down into a bucket and then was using a funnel with water with the crushed ruby in it and was letting it flow down from, let's say, 3 or 4 feet up. He was just holding it in his hand and was letting it run down on top of it and was just letting gravity do the work. And it was a very subtle finish. It didn't get quite as many sort of little speckles as what I'm getting because I am using an air delivery system. Now, I've turned the PSI way down on this because the first time I tried it, I had the PSI turned up and, you were sitting there watching it like blasting away metal and completely destroying the shape and the dimensions of some of the parts. So it is really turned down quite a bit, but it is still a little bit more powerful than that. So there are not a lot of people that I've seen using this technique to do this work. And it seems to be all people that are, sort of doing very small numbers of watches and people that are really sort of trying to achieve something different with the finishes that they're working on in their own watches.
I believe the Japanese watchmaker you're thinking of is Masahiro Kikuno.
It might have been, yeah.
On an industrial scale, the reason they would err away from using something like this is you do need to be paying attention to what you're doing.
Yes.
Because the amount of material being removed by each one of those little pieces of ruby blasting up against the metal is removing significantly more material than would be removed by a finer grain medium.
Yeah, and when I'm talking about putting this into a blast of air and crushed ruby, these parts are spending seconds at most in that blast. Like I am moving it through that blast and, passing it through at a pretty good pace. It's not spending any significant amount of time in there because if you leave it in there for 5 seconds, all of a sudden, none of the ruby holes that have been precision drilled and reamed are going to be accurate anymore, right? Your edges are now all of a sudden, they've been destroyed, and there's no, there's rounded and soft edges in places. The edges of screw holes now all of a sudden have been, have basically been destroyed, and they're a curve now instead of having a nice sharp edge there. So you do have to be very careful with this. It's not like bead blasting. Bead blasting you can get away with a lot, because typically you're talking about glass beads, and those glass beads, while they are hard, they still tend to bounce off of the metal, and they tend to, they have more elasticity than the ruby does, and they don't have sharp edges. And so because of that, you're doing more of a planishing effect with those little glass balls. And with this, because it is sharp, and because the ruby is so hard, it does actually tear away the metal quite quickly. So you do have to be very, very careful when you're doing this. And it's not cheap. This crushed ruby is ridiculously expensive compared to bead blasting media. So that is also another consideration. If you're doing this on an industrial scale, the cost of just media alone would put it beyond what most large companies would be willing to pay.
Mm-hmm. It would take more than a lifetime of broken jewels at the bench to accumulate the amount that you have in that reservoir of medium that you have. And how's the anglage itself been coming along for you?
It's been really good. I'm finally at a point where I'm happy enough with it. It's one of those balances with finishing where you have to get to a point that you're happy and you're still spending a reasonable amount of time on it and not going too far, and you've spent too much time on it, and now you can never recover the costs of how much time you've put into the finishing. So it's never going to be perfect. And so it's a question of how close to that perfect do you want to get before you're happy enough with it, and you can balance out, okay, now somebody other than Jeff Bezos can afford to pay for the work that I've just done on this watch, right? So that's always that balance. So I'd say at this point, if you've got somebody like, let's say, a Dufour, it's sitting at 100% in terms of the quality of finish. These are probably starting to sit at like a 96%, and I'm okay with where it is right now. Only somebody, I think, with a decent loop and an actual knowledge of what's going on with the finishing is really going to notice the little problems that are with it. And those are things that are going to improve over time. These are the first pieces that I'm doing my own anglage on. And while I know a lot about polishing metals, and I know about how to bring up a nice high polish on them, there are all sorts of nuances of how do you put those bevels on there? How do you make sure that they meet properly at a corner? An outside corner, that's very easy. What happens on an inside corner? What happens when you have a curve and it then flows into another line where you don't want that anglage happening across the entire line, because maybe it's going into a pocket that you don't want to have beveled. So there are all sorts of decisions that you have to make there, and it's taken a while to get to make those decisions, to get to the point where I'm happy with where they are, which surfaces I've chosen to bevel, which ones I haven't, how far I've gone, how deep they are. All those are decisions that you have to make, and you can only do them through experience. And as I work on more and more of these, it's becoming faster for me to do that work, and they're becoming better. The last bridge that I did, I was able to do in under an hour, whereas the first one I did, it took me 2 weeks of playing around and figuring out, okay, have I gone too far here? All right, I'm not happy with where that is. I'm not happy with how those edges meet. I'm not happy with the way that line is blended with another one. So those are all things that are, as I work through more and more of these, it will only get better and better. And so I think that at this point, I'm happy with where they are now. 5 years from now, I'm going to look back and say, well, that was sloppy work, but it's still good enough for what I'm trying to do right now, and I'm happy with that.
Well, at this stage, in your mind, what distinguishes a 96 from a 100? What is the gap you will endeavor to close?
When you've made a thing, let's say you're making a piece of high-end jewelry, the making of the thing is probably 90% of the work, at least in terms of, what's actually happening, like making, bringing together a bunch of parts and doing mass forming and things like that. And then that finishing is the next 10%. But the problem is that finishing usually takes more time than the rest of the manufacturing does. And the way I've looked at it through my jewelry making over the years is that, every percent at that point takes as much time as
everything before that,
right? And so it really is, you are working through orders of magnitude of work and effort to get it to that next level. And so the problem is that, getting to a 97% is going to take as much time as it took you to go from 90 to 96%. And do you want to, is it worth that extra time and effort to do it? And absolutely it is once you get to certain stages. But then part of it as well is an experience thing. How do you take that much time to work on this part? I imagine somebody who has no experience doing polishing work would have a very difficult time even getting to the level of polish that I'm getting now. And how do you teach somebody to get to that point? Well, unfortunately, the only way you get to that is by doing it. And so I'm fortunate to have that experience to be, to have already been able to do that finishing in other pieces. So things like how do you go from something with like a 10 cut file, which is still leaving very, very fine, lines on your surface, to then bring it to where it's a bright finish and it looks, for most people, they look at it and go, wow, okay, that is a perfect polish on there. How do you go through that? What types of micro mesh do you use? How far down do you go? I'm going down to a 0.3 micron micro mesh on that surface, but then there's another 2 layers of polishing that happen after that with different buffing compounds and things like that to work with. And so how do you get past that point, and how do you keep going? And that's all just experience and practice. And I think that over the next couple of years, as I get to experiment with more watches and I get to work on more watches, I'll be able to slowly work up to where I'm doing better and better levels of polishing. And some of it is decisions that I make in terms of where those angles go and how deep they are and where they meet and how they meet on the edges and things like that. So some of that's just I need to make a bunch of watches, and that just takes time. It's going to be a few years before I'm truly happy with where the finish is on these watches. But I think right now it's good for what I'm trying to do.
And in this case, many of those decisions are being forced upon you.
Yes.
Because you haven't laid out the bridges, you haven't designed the bridges, so you haven't been able to put in the thought at the outset yourself of exactly how each curve and each cut and each corner edge is going to be finished from the very outset. You're working with a finished in quotation marks. Yeah, a predetermined shape.
Yes.
That you have to work within and then apply your own tastes and wishes and desires to, and then you make the decisions there. But when perhaps down the road you're able to design your own bridges, then you'll be able to put thought in from the very beginning as to how things are going to be finished. And then I think that will help take away a lot of sort of the roadblocks that you encountered working out exactly how you're going to finish these bridges in this case.
It certainly will. And even when I think about the design that we have for the Project Minotaur bridges, because we've redesigned all of those 6497 classic bridges, we've designed our own. And we talked about a lot of that. We made decisions in the design of those bridges where we knew, okay, we want this to look like this. We want that to look like that. We know that if we do this kind of a curve and it blends into that curve, well, then how do we finish that? And we made some decisions where the final finish is going to be more intentional, and it's intended to be angled and beveled in the way that we want it to be. And so it's going to be easier for us to do that because, frankly, we already made those decisions early on in terms of what that was going to look like and where parts were going to meet and where edges were going to meet and things like that. And those weren't necessarily considerations that Swarzsche Chen was making when they designed these bridges. You're right there. As I start designing my own parts and as I start designing my own movements, I'm going to have more control over that, and I'll be able to make decisions that they haven't made for me in a way that I would want to make them. So, yeah, some of that will improve over the years as I make my own movements. And, for now, I'm very, very happy with what Swartz-Etienne has supplied me. They're remarkable little pieces, and they're incredibly well made. I certainly don't want to take away from anything that they've done. They're excellent, excellent work that they've done, and what they've supplied me with is amazing. It's just I have to make choices now that I wouldn't have designed the bridge in the way that they did with the choices that I want to make in terms of that anglage. So we'll see. I'm happy with where it's going and quickly moving through the work that I have now. So I'm hoping that by the end of July, I'm in a position where I have these bridges finished and I can send them back and they can start working on assembling the watches. Because they'll need about 3 or 4 months to be able to actually assemble these watches once they get them back.
Then work will begin on the dials, I presume.
Yeah, the next thing is going to be dials. I haven't done nearly enough work on those dials. I've been experimenting a little bit with some designs, and I know what the general layout of the watch dial needs to be. I know what I'm doing in terms of typefaces and things like that. That's all pretty much set in stone at this point. There's a little bit of tweaking that Lee's going to be helping me with in terms of getting exact placement of numbers and things like that. So there's a few things that need to be tweaked a little bit. Really, at this point, the big thing is going to be the engine turning and getting that working right and getting the engine turning to a point where I'm happy with it. So once I'm looking forward to getting the anglage done and getting those bridges back to Swartz-Etienne, because then I can start to actually focus on the dials, and that's the next really, really big thing. And the hands, I haven't really done any work on the hands yet, so I need to start focusing on those too.
So you're taking the inverted Daniels approach?
Well, no, I already had a pretty good idea of what the dial was going to look like, and frankly, the dial was sort of predetermined in a lot of ways because, again, they designed the movement for me. So, I know where the minute and hour hand are going to go. I know that there's a sub-second dial. I know that there's a power reserve indicator at 9 o'clock. All of those are decisions that they had already made. So I'm working within that, and I have to sort of decide how that's going to look.
Well, a lot has certainly happened since we last recorded. There's Watches and Wonders, WWDC, all sorts of fun stuff, many new surprise releases from a number of brands, which clearly we didn't have time to touch on today. Hopefully not as much time passes between now and the next time we get together, given that the lockdown measures have ended, and hopefully we can get the ball rolling once again on Project Minotaur there. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how things come together for these dials for you.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.